Okay, hey guys, welcome to my channel. I am Thembelihle and today I have a panel discussion. We are joined today by Busisiwe Deyi, Jade, Trueman, Ngcai, and of course myself. I've titled this discussion, "Without community there's no liberation." So today we are speaking about our experience as Black women, women of color, particularly from a lens of friendship, our experiences within communities that we've built for ourselves, and some of the nuances that we meet within these communities that we find ourselves in, and the ones that we come from, as well as the ones that we create. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Bell Hooks constantly, refers to certain women as terrorists. She's called Beyonce a terrorist. She's referred to white women as terrorists, and a lot of the time it's people who actively harm disadvantaged Black women, queer people, trans people, marginalized people in general through their positions as capitalists, patriarchs, or apologists, or whatever kind of harmful place you may be in, despite your positionality being that of a woman. What do you guys think of feminism as a sisterhood? Is it a sisterhood? Should it be a sisterhood?
I'm really interested in conversations around feminism that seek to subvert those very systems, right? I'm interested in how feminism has been co-opted, right? As a form of empowerment, right? But also the forms of what that empowerment looks like, right? And when we talk about these various women being terrorists, I think it's within the context of how empowerment rearranges these structures of power as liberation, right? And what do I mean by that? I mean that when we look at ideas around sexual liberation, around financial economic liberation, what has happened is that the systems of racialized capitalism are still intact, right? I mean, the conversation that's been happening on social media is about the soft life. And a part of me was really concerned because how does that soft life look like, right? If it means that you have a helper, for instance, do you consider the fact that that helper is a marginalized woman in particular ways? And how then does that position you in relation to marginalized women in that very same position? And are you accepting of the potential that you might be in a position of exploitation in living your soft life? Who serves you? Who creates the soft life? And who's exploited in the soft life, right? So I'm interested in conversations that sort of like speak against these ideas that truly reimagine what a feminist society might look like, right? It looks inclusive of trans women for me. It looks inclusive of Black women with disabilities. It looks inclusive in very radical ways. It looks like free education. It looks like access to housing for marginalized women. Free housing for marginalized women. So I think that for me, when we speak about safe spaces and creating safe spaces, I think that we have to be aware, I think that's the point, how the ways in which we imagine liberation for ourselves is not merely positioning us back at the top of a hierarchy where we can justify the continued exploitation of other marginalized women, right?
Where do we locate humanism, like at the core, and where do we locate the soft space between softness and hardness? Like, can we live in between the dichotomy of those spaces in a way that serves all of us? Is it possible? Is it not? I feel as though we're exposed to structural components constantly because that's the core of how society is structured anyway. Like, where is that place of humanism that exists in between the spaces? Is it possible for us to unlearn the hardness of the structure and relearn what softness means and still exist there? How do we reimagine that softness?
I've always been honest with people, and I've said, I know there are different kinds of feminisms, but I've never been able to identify with feminism purely because some of the ideologies of feminism are alienating to disabled women, for instance. And I talked about this in one of my own videos about sexualization, desexualization. Feminism calls for women to be sexually liberal. I don't have that opportunity because society desexualizes me, or I'm a fetish. So I've never been able to claim it, and I've never, not really been invited to the fold, but I haven't felt feminists pushing hard to say, yes, there's sexual liberation, but how can we account for women who aren't even seen as sexual beings? So for me, I don't know if I would say it's a sisterhood. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there in terms of how does it accommodate women who are outside of that structure. And I think another example is loving our bodies. That's a huge thing. And I think within the context of disability, I don't love my body on some days. Can I still be feminist if I hate my body? Do you know what I mean? How do I exist within those two worlds where I want to preach or advocate for body positivity, but I have a body that's failing me? So how do I stay true to my antagonism towards my body, but also advocate for self-love and body love?
Someone was saying, can't I just be body neutral? Like, I don't have to aggressively love my body and think it's beautiful for it to be or for it to matter. Because I think body positivity always emphasizes the beauty or accept my imperfections. When I'm just like, this is it. I don't want to. And I'm also interrogating these ideas that we so aggressively want to identify as. Like, maybe if this was 5 years ago, I would have been like, what do you mean I'm not a feminist? Like, now, those ideas, knowing that they're so rooted in whiteness or white liberation or the white terrorist woman, have become so alienating. And I think all of our experiences are extremely nuanced, coming from a disabled perspective. That is like wild, that you can say one of the tenets is body positivity, sexual liberation, all these things that I believe a cisgendered, white, able-bodied woman can see as liberation, but that doesn't look like liberation to us anymore.
Oftentimes, I vacillate between, feminism is always sort of like is sold as this answer for women, right? That all women can fit into feminism. What remains uninterrogated is the fact that even within the feminist movement, there were disagreements.
Yes.
For instance, even within the first wave feminists were absolutely racist. They wanted the right to vote, but because they wanted to distinguish themselves from the nigger or the black person, right? So rooted within fundamentally those waves of feminism was this idea that feminism wanted to separate itself from being a woman at that time, wanted to separate from themselves from being in the same position as the black person or as the kafir or as the nigger, right? And so rooted within that dynamic is the idea of racism, but also rooted within that involvement is that black women are not part of the feminist movement, right? Yeah. Black women had to create their own feminist, organizations in order to speak to. And when you look at the movements of black women, their claims of liberation, right, were very different to what white women. So white women centered the right to vote and the right to gain citizenship because that was the bar that disallowed them the recognition of their humanity, right? right? Or to be equal to men.
Yeah.
But black women wanted equality of employment, equality of wages. They wanted subsidized childcare. They wanted claims of, housing the homeless. So you see that integral to conceptions of liberation for black women particularly were those factors that create a life, where we can create a life, right? Because we're centered in our communities, we're centered in creating and nourishing life, right? So I think that when we interrogate feminism, we have to interrogate it with understanding that very racist history and how black women then within that space, right? When we speak of bell hooks, of Audre Lorde, we speak of women who were calling out racism in the feminist movement. When you go into the black feminist movement, for me, you see that the understanding embedded within that softness cannot exist within a space where we are denied access to healthcare, access to education, access to those things that make a healthy life possible for us all. Even body positivity, it's a black women's movement. It's rooted in the idea, not even the idea of beauty, but that my body existing how it exists is okay. I have issues with loving my body for various reasons, right? But the idea was not to love your body, but that your body is a valid and inherently valuable body, right? And not necessarily that something that could be commercialized, but it could be seen as one of a sort of spectrum of bodies that exist, right? So I think that when white women come and take over any movement, it goes to shit.
I think also what this speaks to is that with black women finding their own source of liberation, it comes from a place of survival more than what it is just privileged positions that move you forward. Like we're just here trying to survive. The nourishment of self and the acceptance of self is rooted in survival. Why do we constantly just have to fight to survive? I also personally don't necessarily agree with what feminism stands for, because I don't feel that I fit into any placement. It's my skin color has certain consequences. There's certain responsibilities that I want to take on because of my fair-skinned privilege. There's certain responsibilities that I have to take on because I am surrounded by black women, and it is a willingness and a very intentional willingness to lay out the responsibility of what my skin means, also how I view my own body. I don't necessarily even identify as being any kind of gender, and so where in feminism am I included? Is there a place for me really? I don't know. I experienced dysmorphia and dysphoria, and it's a soft kind of balance on trying to understand how to navigate, how I view myself and how to navigate. So where there are predetermined labels on how women ought to look, or I don't identify with those things at all. So it makes it very difficult for me to navigate any feminist space, simply because it can be exclusionary, or I've experienced it in that way, and so I've had to navigate or create my own path of accepting myself for who I am outside of that space, whilst also acknowledging the space. I don't know where that falls into feminism, but I think that it's also a valid way it should be a valid way of navigating feminism. There should be a space for people like myself who don't necessarily identify with any predetermined label, like there should be the space for me.
I think for me, like in conceptualizing this discussion, my source for research and reading is from feminist discourse, and that's because those are people who have created the language for us. But I knew that in this discussion, we'll probably find new ways of articulating our experiences, and they don't have to be located in, spaces that already exist. Like, we need to find that liminality where I can safely say, I don't feel like this represents me anymore, but it's because I've found ways to articulate myself within this discourse. I'm not going to say, fuck bell hooks, fuck Audrey, or they are the people, and amongst many other Black feminist scholars, they're the ones who've given us this language, and I think it's our responsibility to interrogate, because that's what they were doing with those first waves as well.
To build on what Jade was saying about navigating feminism as exclusionary as it is now. And just I want to bring it back to maybe community. Even though feminism is exclusionary to me, I am still fighting to be a part of it, and I still believe that it can be changed, because I think for Black women, it is safer to be in a community of women rather than outside. So that's why I still believe, instead of just saying, feminism, I don't believe let me just do my own thing. I think it's safer for us to be this way, even though we may be harmful to each other, but we are stronger as a collective. And that's why I think it's important to still...
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think which leads us to the next segue, which is this notion of romantic friendship or platonic romance. It was just triggered by a thread I recently read about this person conceptualizing what it means for Black women, or just women in general, to marry one another as platonic friends, but to create that environment for raising children, buying property, upward social mobility, be it class, status, and so on. And I think bell hooks articulates it very well, where she said, along the way we do find soulmates, true friends, life companions, we find communion, another great wisdom, gift that women offer to those who have not yet discovered its pleasures is the wisdom that it is better to know the joy of dancing in a circle of love than to dance alone, which speaks exactly to what Thembelihle was saying. What are your thoughts on the idea of a romantic friendship, platonic spouses? And I think we can even open it up to just that community that we create for ourselves, the chosen family, spending Christmas with family as queer people, all of these structures that we build for ourselves.
Okay, so I'm really interested in the idea of friends and friends, because I think that it in a way it can be liberatory, right? Where you shift the focus and the centering of your attention. This is a silly thing about sort of the heteronormatized conception. Is that what is seen as productive, what is seen as acceptable, is the centering of this one person, right? And that destabilizes community, right? Because if your community are 4 people, a spouse and 2.5 kids with a pet, then your locus or your center is very narrow. That destabilizes our ability to find community education programs, or found community education programs, or to even sort of be in solidarity with others outside. I mean, I was listening to this podcast, and the question that was posed to the psychologist was, how do I start dating as a single mother? And he was just sort of fumbling his way through this question, because you could tell he wasn't really. It's what? Then he hit on a point that, I don't think he even realized. He was well, you could form communities of single mothers, and if you go on a date, then that there's somebody else to take care of you. And I found that potentially liberatory because we move away from these conceptions of centering men or centering the singular spouse as the end-all and be-all, and that they become sort of like an accessory to an already enriched life, right? That you can create, your friendships are primary spaces of healing, of care, of support. And for me, it allows them to actually take away the power from men. You know, on Twitter, when men are like, well, I'd never marry a 28-year-old. Who wants to marry you? Yeah. The idea that men feel like they are the prize. I think for heterosexual women, this is the hill mountain I'm Ngcai on. I think true liberation, particularly for heterosexual women, lies in divesting from centering men as the end goal. And what perhaps Bell Hooks, implies in, calling Beyonce a terrorist is that Beyonce is not structurally very different to ideas around heteronormativity and capitalism. She has a husband that she has stuck through whatever. Her husband is the center of her world. Be damned her career, be damned what image issues he might bring about. She will work on it, and making money with a husband is much more valuable than making money. Beyonce doesn't need Jay-Z. Like, Beyonce doesn't need to be in partnership with him to be a successful woman. She could be a single mother or a single human being having kids. She doesn't need, she's talented, but there's something intrinsically that brings her value up. Men respect her. There's this desexualization of Beyonce that has been happening, where men cannot phantom having sex with her. They cannot even fantasize about potentially getting with her because, well, she has a husband. What do you need? And it's a husband they respect. So I have dinner with her. Rather they would have dinner with Jay-Z for tips on how to become a millionaire. And you're just like, it'll never happen when you go sit down. So I think for me, the most powerful thing, once heterosexual women disinvest from white feminism and move towards black, radical, socialist feminism,